We would now like to display and manipulate our depth profiles. Let's first go to the directory and determine which profiles we want to look at. Pressing function key 13 allows us to enter the directory. We want to make sure that, once again, instruction is highlighted. We then want to list files, which is soft key number 2. We want our listing type to be extended, so pressing function key number 3 and toggling to extended, and then pressing soft key number 1 to execute. Our profile sample was stored under a file name with the prefix PRO. At the bottom of the page we see PRO201, but that is a survey scan, so it is not a profile that we want to look at. We will then press soft key number 1 and go to the next page. Here we see in the analysis column that we have 3 profiles. The first one, file name PRO202, was our window profile. The second profile, file name PRO302, was our 2-point profile. And the third one, file name PRO402, was another window profile where we suspended the profile and took a survey scan. The 2 profiles we would like to evaluate are PRO202 and PRO302. We can now exit from the directory, pressing soft key number 8. Again, soft key number 8 to continue our exit. We now want to load those 2 files. Pressing function key 15 will allow us to enter the load menu. What we would like to do now is load PRO202 and, pressing function key number 2, we would also like to load PRO302. We would first like to evaluate PRO202, so we will press function key number 1 so that line number 1 is highlighted. And we now want to display that menu, pressing soft key number 1. Taking a look at the profile display menu, we see that we could toggle the file name from PRO202 to PRO302. That is why in the load menu I loaded both of them, so when we are finished with PRO202, we can toggle to PRO302. We also notice that if we had multiple areas, we could choose which area profile we wanted to display. In this case, we only have one area. Function key number 2 will allow us to display the profile in 2 different modes, either the profile mode or the region mode, which would then allow us to evaluate the window which was used to acquire the peak-to-peak data for the profile. If we were in the region mode, we can also choose which region we want displayed. But also in the profile mode, we can choose which region we want displayed. We can look at the peak-to-peak data from individual regions rather than looking at all of them being displayed on the same graph. We can also leave the region display toggled to all. That way we will see the profile as it was acquired. We can now display that profile by pressing soft key number 1 to display. Here we see the peak-to-peak height values of the elements which we monitored in the profile. The first one is carbon. The second one is chromium in blue. The third one is oxygen in green. We also see silicon, which here is displayed in a gray, and the copper, which is displayed in purple. To more clearly display the menu portion of the profile display, let's toggle off the graphics label. To do that, we first have to exit this mode by pressing soft key number 8. We can then toggle the graphics label off with the shift key and function key 14. Now we can re-enter the display menu, shift and function key 15. It is now easier to see the profile display menu. As you can see, we have the profile displayed with all regions. We could also display the profile and individual regions, or multiple regions of our choice. Let's first demonstrate showing one region rather than all regions. Going back to the profile, we see oxygen, which is region number 2. Now back to the menu, what we would like to do is display only the oxygen peak. Pressing function key 3, we can then enter the region number for oxygen, which is region number 2. Pressing the enter key, we can now display that by pressing soft key number 1. We now have only the oxygen peak displayed, the peak-to-peak height for oxygen. What we could also do is add another region to that. Looking at the display menu, we have region number 2 displayed. Let's also display region number 5, which is our silicon region. This time what we would like is to, rather than pressing soft key number 1, which will erase our current graph and redisplay only with the silicon, we would like to do a display add auto, which is soft key number 3. That will automatically add the silicon peak-to-peak height line to the already existing oxygen line. Next, we would like to look at individual regions. What we would like to do is, from the profile, evaluate the oxygen peak. According to the profile, we have some oxygen at the surface, but we have more oxygen through the chromium layer, and then oxygen goes to 0 once we get into the copper layer. What we would like to do is look at the oxygen peak at 0 minutes, which is cycle number 2. We acquired the data sputtering every half minute. Therefore, at 4 minutes, that would be 8 cycles from 0 plus our 2 pre-sputter cycles. So cycle number 10 would be the oxygen peak at 4 minutes. What I would like to do is look at the region and evaluate that data and determine whether oxygen is indeed there or whether we have a peak overlap with the chromium. Going to the menu, we now want to change our mode from profile display to region, pressing function key number 2 and toggling to region. function key number 3, we want region number 2, which is our oxygen, and we would like cycle number 1 or cycle number 2. Either one is pre-sputter cycle for oxygen. So let's look at cycle number 1. We now want to display that. We display by pressing soft key number 1. This is our oxygen peak. We also have it wide enough window that it overlaps with the chromium peak. Again, in evaluating the peak-to-peak height, we need to look at the differentiated spectrum. So we will enter the data massage, soft key number 5. We can then go to our previous bank by pressing function key 22. What we would like to do is differentiate and smooth this spectrum. We can do that by pressing soft key number 2. We now have the differentiated spectrum measuring the peak-to-peak height of that spectrum will give us the peak-to-peak height of oxygen. But notice that the oxygen peak is really from here to here. It is not included in the whole graph. It is a very small portion of that graph. This tells me that the peak-to-peak height data, which is displayed beyond 0 minutes, could be wrong. What I would like to do now is to add the oxygen region at cycle number 10, which is 4 minutes into the profile. To do that, we want to return to the menu, which is Shift and function key number 15. With that menu, we still want the mode to be in region. We want region number 2. Now we want cycle number 10. I would now like to add that by pressing soft key number 3. This is now our N of E spectrum at 4 minutes into the profile. Let's also differentiate. So we need to enter the data massage bank by pressing soft key number 5. And soft key number 2 will then apply a 5-point differentiation and a 5-point smooth. Now they are both displayed full scale. What I would like to do is display them both on the same scale. To do that, I will once again enter the display menu, holding the Shift key and pressing function key 15. Going to the display menu, we want region number 2. Let's start with cycle number 1. So I'll press function key 4 and enter cycle number 1. I still have an option of displaying the massage data or the unmassaged data. What I would like is the massage data. That means the differentiated data. Pressing function key number 5 and toggling to yes. I now want to display that and replace this graph. So if I press soft key number 1, that will display region number 2, cycle number 1, differentiated. Now I would like cycle number 10, pressing function key number 4, entering 10 for cycle number. I also want the massage data. This time I want it displayed automatically added to this graph with the corrected scale factor. I can do that by pressing display add auto, soft key number 3. Now we can see the relative peak-to-peak heights on the same scale. In order to evaluate exactly where the computer evaluated this data to obtain the peak-to-peak height, we need to go into the profile redefine. Again, that is a data massage, pressing soft key number 5, going to the next data bank by pressing function key 23. We see that soft key number 3 says profile redefine. Let's enter the profile redefine menu. The analysis window, when we set up the profile, read from the element table. That was set with a lower limit of 495. So let's duplicate that, 495, and an upper limit of 520, 520. Now looking at the graph, we see where the peak-to-peak height was measured for the oxygen peak. Notice that when we have no oxygen there, which is the graph that is now in white, that is our cycle number 10, or at 4 minutes, we see that there really is no oxygen there, but from the analysis window, it measures the peak-to-peak height, the peak positive excursion being measured here, negative excursion being measured here. So with the window set as it was set in the element table, it appears we have oxygen when in fact we have no oxygen. So in looking at these individual windows, number one, we can determine whether the peak-to-peak height is actually looking at the peak we want it to, or whether it is evaluating an overlapping peak, which we have in this case. And number two, we can now redefine those windows so that we do not get the influence of the positive excursion of the chromium peak. Once again, looking at the menu, what we can do is we can change the lower limit and upper limit either by typing in a value, as I did, or by using the cursor. Looking at the graph, let's redefine this window. What we would like is to, for sure, we want to include the peak-to-peak height of oxygen using the oxygen peak as a guide from cycle number 1, but we also, by looking at the second graph from cycle number 10, we also do not want to include a positive or negative excursion that would give us erroneous data. So let's move our lower limit using the cursor to near the positive excursion of the oxygen peak. We then want to move our upper limit, pressing function key number 2 and moving that upper limit down. We now have a window defined that includes the positive and negative excursion of oxygen when it is present, but it does not include a lot of signal when the oxygen is absent. We would like to define this as our new analysis window. Now that we have that set, we have evaluated the data, we have set our lower and upper limits, we can now define that as our new window, and the computer will then go through and on every cycle, every window, it will duplicate what we have done here, a 5-point differentiation, and set the new windows, measure that peak-to-peak height of the data within this newly defined window, and we can then look at the profile and see how it has changed. Let's define that window by pressing soft key number 1. Looking at soft key number 1, we see that define window has turned a shade of green. While it is performing that function, it will remain that shade of green. When it has finished that operation, it will then return to the shade of blue, which is displayed in the other soft keys next to define window. So right now we are performing the operation of redefine, where once again it is looking at every window that we have stored every cycle, and it is changing the analysis window from 495 up to 520. We have redefined that to a window of lower limit 506, upper limit 515.5. So going back to the full screen, we see that this is our newly defined window. And looking at the menu, we see that the window is defined as a lower limit of 506 and an upper limit of 515.5. The function of redefining the window is now complete. Let's look at the depth profile. We now want to exit from this menu, enter the profile display menu, holding the shift key and pressing function key number 15. Looking at the menu, we now want to display the profile and not the region, pressing function key 2 and toggling to profile, and function key 3 and toggling to all. We can now redisplay the depth profile with the newly defined oxygen by pressing soft key number 1. We now see a dramatic difference in the oxygen peak. Before, we had oxygen displayed very high in the region where we have high chromium. Now that we have redefined that window, notice that oxygen is very low where we're seeing chromium. Again, now that we have redefined the window, that tells us that the oxygen peak that we were seeing originally was strongly influenced by the chromium peak, when indeed there was no oxygen present. Now we have demonstrated the profile redefine, and we have a more accurate representation of the amount of oxygen through the film. I would also like to evaluate the carbon peak. Looking at carbon, we see that it looks like we have carbon at cycle number 10, again at 4 minutes, and then carbon goes away once we get into the copper film. What I would like to do is make sure that carbon is real in this region at cycle number 10, and that it is not erroneous data. Returning to the display menu, we now want the mode to be region once again, pressing function key number 2 and toggling to region display. We also want region number 1 and cycle number 10. That will give us our carbon peak at cycle number 10. By pressing soft key number 1, we can then display the carbon peak. To evaluate that, let's differentiate it. Enter our data massage, pressing soft key number 5. Going to the previous bank, pressing function key 22. And let's use the 5-point differentiation, 5-point smooth, soft key number 2. We now see the carbon peak at 4 minutes into the profile. We see that indeed we have a real peak present, so it is not erroneous data, it is indeed a carbon peak. Returning now to the profile, let's return first to the menu, Shift and function key 15. We can then redisplay the profile, pressing function key number 2 and toggling to profile, and function key number 3 and toggling to all. To display that, we then press soft key number 1. And we have now evaluated our carbon peak and assured ourselves that we do indeed have carbon at 4 minutes into the profile. We also see silicon, that we have silicon at 4 minutes into the profile. At least apparently we have silicon. We would like to evaluate that. Again, going to the menu, let's change the display mode to region, pressing function key 2 to region. The region number should be region number 5, pressing function key 3 and entering the number 5. And let's again evaluate that at cycle number 10. To display that, we press soft key number 1. We see the N of E data for silicon. Let's again differentiate that, enter the data massage with soft key number 5, and press soft key number 2 to differentiate 5 and smooth 5. Notice here that we have random noise. This indicates that where apparently from the peak-to-peak data we have silicon, it is instead measuring the peak-to-peak of what we see within this window, and evaluating this, we can see that it is noise. It is not a real silicon signal. What that will do is, if we allow that to be calculated in the atomic concentration profile, it will tell us that we have silicon that is not really there. So we want to keep that in mind when we calculate the atomic concentration. Again, the region display is very important in helping us to understand and evaluate our data so that we understand exactly what the computer is measuring. Again, it is measuring the peak-to-peak height, in this instance, of noise level. Let's return to the profile, Shift, function key number 15. Let's display the profile again, changing the mode to profile and regions to all, and soft key number 1 to display. Let's briefly review what we've learned about this profile so far. First, we looked at the oxygen peak and determined that the analysis window was incorrectly set. So by utilizing the profile redefine routine, we were able to more accurately define the oxygen peak from the start of the profile all the way through the chromium peak, and we eliminated most of the influence by the chromium. We then assumed that carbon might have been doing something similar, in that we see a carbon layer through the chromium, but we do not see it in the copper. So we evaluated the copper peak at cycle number 10, or 4 minutes into the profile, and we found that indeed we did have carbon there. So the carbon peak-to-peak height is a real indication of the amount of carbon present. We then looked at the silicon peak, which looks like we have as much silicon present as we do carbon through all of the layer. Evaluating the peak-to-peak height of silicon at 4 minutes, we find that indeed there is no silicon present. It is only noise level that is being displayed. What we would like to do is obtain a copy first of this graph. Then we would like to obtain an atomic concentration. But let's keep in mind that in that atomic concentration, we do not want the silicon peak to be included in the atomic concentration calculation, silicon being region number 5. Let's obtain a copy of this. First, let's exit the menu display, pressing soft key number 8. Let's toggle the graphics label back on, holding the shift key and pressing function key 14. Let's now enter our data massage bank by pressing function key number 21 and soft key number 5. We can graphics annotate by pressing soft key number 8. Enter the text. What I would like to do is label the chromium peak, the copper, the carbon, and the silicon. Again, we are obtaining this copy in black and white, so we want to label the peaks so that we do not become confused. This is our chromium peak. Carbon. Copper. And our silicon peak is riding relatively high background. Our silicon. We can now get a copy of that by exiting the text menu and by holding the control key and pressing the print. What we now want to do is redisplay the profile. When we ask for an atomic concentration profile, it will calculate the atomic concentration, including all of the regions which we have displayed. So what we would like to do is display this profile without the silicon peak. To do that, let's once again toggle our graph labeling off so that we can more easily see the profile display menu. Holding the shift key and pressing function key number 14. Let's now enter the display menu, holding the shift key and function key 15. Going to the profile display menu, we want our mode to be profile, but instead of all regions, we want regions 1, 2, 3, and 4. We do not want to include region number 5. What I'll do then is press function key number 3, and I'll start with region number 4. And we now want to display that by pressing soft key number 1. This will be our copper peak. Going back to the profile display menu, we see that the region is still highlighted, so we can enter region 3 and then press soft key number 3 to display add auto region number 3. That being our chromium peak. We can now type in region 2, press soft key number 3, display add auto the oxygen peak, and enter region number 1, display add auto soft key number 3, and our carbon peak. If we now ask for an atomic concentration profile, it will not include the silicon peak because the silicon peak is not displayed. It will again calculate the atomic concentration at every cycle with only the peaks we have displayed, that being carbon, chromium, oxygen, and copper. To do that, let's enter the data massage bank, pressing soft key number 5, going to the next massage bank, pressing function key 23. We see that soft key number 1 allows AC profile. By pressing soft key number 1, we obtain the atomic concentration profile for this sample. Let's toggle our graphics back on, Shift and function key 14. Let's now label this graph using soft key number 8 for graph annotate. Chromium, carbon, and copper. The copper and the oxygen at the bottom of the graph is a little bit difficult to see. What we can do is expand that in our next graph. Let's first get a copy of this. We can exit the graph annotate, and we can also obtain a copy by using the print graphics soft key, which is soft key number 7. We would now like to expand. What I would like to do is expand from 0 to 10%. Notice again, this is our atomic concentration. So the left graph is being displayed from 0 to 100%. I would like to expand from 0 to 10%. Let's enter the expand menu by pressing soft key number 5. In order to get these bars, which come up at 1/3 and 2/3, to get them full scale, we can press the full scale command, which is soft key number 3. And what I would now like to do is move the upper bar of the expand down to the 10%. To do that, I press function key number 4, which will allow me to move the upper and the right bar, and I can then slew the upper bar using the down arrow to the 10% line, And I now want to expand all, pressing soft key number 2. We now have displayed on the left graph, we see that it is from 0 to 10%. And we can more easily now evaluate our oxygen peak and the copper, which is in red, oxygen is in blue. And we can also see where the carbon and the chromium has fallen off to a 0 baseline, or essentially no signal once we get into the copper layer. We can now exit our expand menu, pressing soft key number 8. And we can graph annotate, soft key number 8. This is our copper signal, oxygen, copper once again, oxygen, and carbon. We can also get a copy of that by exiting the Graph Annotate menu and pressing soft key number 7 for print graphics. We have now demonstrated how to obtain an atomic concentration profile without an element which would give us erroneous data. That is, to display the profile regions which we want included in the atomic concentration profile. We can also obtain atomic concentration numbers, the atomic concentration graph, from any cycle which we choose. Let's once again look at cycle number 10, which is sputter time, or in the profile, 4 minutes. And we can also compare that with cycle number 1, which is 0 minutes. Once again, we want to not include the silicon peak. Let's first clear the graph using Control Clear. Let's re-enter the menu, Shift and Function key 15. Let's now enter the data massage using soft key number 5. To enter the atomic concentration menu, we hold the Shift key and press function key number 2. When we first enter the atomic concentration menu, we can choose which area. Once again, we only have one area, so in this case we have no choice. But we can also choose which cycle we want to calculate the atomic concentration. Let's start with cycle number 1. Now that we have chosen that cycle number, we can select the regions by using soft key number 4, which is labeled Select Regions. In this menu, we see that area 1, cycle 1, and the region 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 with the element name of that region. If I press function key number 1 and toggle region 1 out to 2, that tells me I have oxygen, region 3 is chromium, 4 is copper, and region 5 is silicon. This is very similar to the atomic concentration menu which we demonstrated in the section on multiplex. At this point we want to omit the silicon region, so we toggle to region number 5, which is silicon, and we can omit that region using soft key number 5. We also want to select the endpoints for the oxygen. To do that, we toggle the region to oxygen, pressing function key number 1, toggling it to region number 2, which is our oxygen region. We now want to select the endpoints, which is soft key number 4. That will display the oxygen peak at cycle number 1. We see that our left endpoint is at 502.5. We have changed that to 506. We also have our right endpoint set at 516, and we had changed that to 515.5. So we will change those endpoints. Once we have selected the proper endpoints, we are done, pressing soft key number 8. And we can now ask for the AC table, pressing soft key number 1. We now have the atomic concentration table for our profile at 0 minutes. Element carbon, oxygen, chromium, copper. Notice we have excluded the silicon because we omitted that. We have the atomic concentration in this column and the sensitivity factor used in this column. We can now get a copy of this table by holding the control key and pressing print. We now want to get an atomic concentration table for cycle number 10. This is cycle number 1. Let's exit this menu. Holding the shift key and pressing soft key number 2, we can re-enter the atomic concentration menu. Looking at the menu, we want cycle number 10. We then want to select regions, pressing soft key number 4. Once again, looking at the menu, we want to omit region number 5, so we will toggle to region 5, our silicon peak. We want to omit that region, pressing soft key number 5. We want to select the endpoints of our oxygen, region number 2, select endpoints, soft key number 4. This will now give us a graph of the oxygen peak at cycle number 10. Once again, we want to redefine those endpoints to 506, the left endpoint, and the right endpoint, 515.5. Now that we have them defined, we are done, so we can press soft key number 8. And we can ask for the atomic concentration table, soft key number 1. We now see the atomic concentration table for cycle number 10. Notice chromium is much higher. This is the chromium-rich region, showing 86.62% chromium. Once again, we have eliminated or omitted the silicon from the calculation. We also have our sensitivity factors used. We can once again get a copy by holding the Control key and pressing Print. We have now demonstrated how we can evaluate the window depth profile by looking at the individual regions to determine if there is peak overlap, if there is, to redefine that window. Also to determine if a peak is really there or if we are measuring the noise level. How we can obtain an atomic concentration profile, and how we can obtain the atomic concentration table for any cycle we choose. We're now ready to look at the depth profile of a point mode. This again was the profiles for a window mode, which allowed us to look at individual regions. With the point profile, we evaluated the peak-to-peak height of the N of E peak, taking the peak minus background in the N of E mode. To evaluate the 2-point depth profile, let's first exit from this menu, pressing soft key number 8. We now want to enter our display menu using the Shift key and function key 15. Our 2-point profile is PRO 302. Pressing function key number 1, we can toggle to PRO 302 and then strike enter. Notice now that our mode is only profile mode. The reason for that is we have no regions to display. We took 2-point profiles, peak minus background. We did not take a window, so we cannot display any individual regions. But we can display the peak-to-peak height of individual regions. Let's first look at all regions. So we will leave function key number 2 toggled to all and press soft key number 1 to display the profile. This is our 2-point profile. Notice carbon was very strong on the surface and then fell away quite rapidly. We see an interesting oxygen peak. We do not see that peak overlap in the 2-point profile, which we saw in the window profile. That is because we are not differentiating and measuring any background. It is peak minus background. And as long as there is no peak overlap when we select the energy of the peak and the energy of the background, when oxygen is absent, the oxygen peak-to-peak height will go to 0. We also, since we cannot display windows, we do not have sensitivity factors for N of E data, so we cannot obtain an atomic concentration of this profile. So essentially, what we see in the peak-to-peak profile display is the only information that we can get from a 2-point profile. So what we can do is enter the data massage. Let's annotate soft key number 8. And let's label these peaks. First we have chromium. We have carbon. Oxygen. And copper. Let's also annotate and say that this is our 2-point profile. We'll call it the 2-point profile mode. And annotate. To obtain a copy, we can exit the graph annotate, and using soft key number 7, print graphics. Another thing we can do to more accurately see what is going on with the oxygen peak is to expand this in the horizontal direction. Let's enter the expand menu using function key number 5. We want to expand full scale in the vertical direction. The easiest way to do that is to press soft key number 3. If we look at the expand menu near the top of the screen, we see that the lower left time position is set at 0 minutes. The upper right time position is full scale, or 21.7 minutes. What I would like to do is change the upper right to about 3 minutes and expand out to 3 minutes. To do that, we can press function key number 5 and enter 3 for 3 minutes. If we now look at the graph, we see a bar showing us where we will expand when we expand horizontally. Once we have that set, we can then expand all, which is soft key number 2. Notice now we get more definition of the oxygen peak-to-peak height. Let's now exit the expand menu, and let's annotate the graph and obtain a copy. Once again, the 2-point profile mode. Expanded. To obtain a copy, we will exit and use soft key number 7. We have demonstrated how to display and manipulate various portions of the Auger profiles, also how to display regions within that profile and evaluate whether the peak is there or not, and also to change the analysis window using the profile redefine. Previously, we discussed how to massage survey scans, multiplex data, line scans, and maps. This concludes the section on data massage.